This is Duke University.
So the title of our panel, coming from Emma Goldman, I couldn't help focusing my talk on the queer and feminist angle of the oppositional politics in Turkey. Although many of the tactics employed in the protests by feminists and queers are artistic per se, such as drums and dance and dress up and standing still and what have you, first and foremost, I see these movements urge to resist normalization as art with a big A in itself. In my brief amount of time, I will try to contextualize the normalizing landscape of the AKP government, as well as the bifurcated politics of assimilation in Turkey, and I will touch upon the deconstructive modes of resistance rather than a defensive mode, which became very popular during the Gezi uprising, but has its roots in the queer and feminist movements, I think. In a nutshell, my argument is, since 2002, when AKP first came into power, especially in the international media, Turkish politics have been pigeonholed between a neoliberal democracy championed by the AKP government versus a nationalist secular republicanism. However, feminists, queers, along with the Kurdish movement, have been trying to operate outside of this space and been blowing the whistle in pointing out that this seeming oppositional framework is merely two sides of the same coin. It is the same assimilationist logic of the Turkish state version 2.0 versus 3.0 perhaps. Only in the latter, the priority of exclusion is a justice from a republican unitarity to a moral unitarity. Therefore, it's no surprise to me, at least, that the politics of morality or the celebration of immorality, such as reclaiming the label Çalıcı, as Süreyya mentioned, which could be translated as thugs or looters or plunderers in English, became central in the Gezi uprising. And for people who may not know, the Gezi uprising happened last June. It started as a reaction to the demolition of a public park and its subsequent transformation into a shopping mall, and sort of ended up becoming a month-long anti-government protests and interventions around Turkey. When the Turkish government used excessive force against the protesters who had gathered at Gezi Park, press outlets around the globe over and over asked this question: wait a minute, has the Turkish Prime Minister been fooling the West? Is he in fact a traditionalist autocrat in liberal drag? Yet again, pitching these two overlapping modes as if they are contradictory. Tayyip Erdogan, in fact, has been an exemplary neoliberal politician, closely following the identity-based movements in Turkey and attempting to co-opt some into his diversity politics while further marginalizing others, such as Kurds who won't unite under AKP's Islamic Ummah rhetoric, or LGBT folks who, much like feminists and communists, threaten the AKP's moral order. The moral order, perhaps I should say harmony, that the AKP government seeks after for a stable ground for economic development, the type of neoliberal economic development that they want. In AKP's discourse, the marginalizing label of divisive forces of the old regime, which targeted the Kurdish movement since the 80s and the Islamists since the 90s, got replaced with the more straightforward marginals, which meant people who disturb the moral order or people who are against the economic development, or both. Queers and feminist movements, of course, got the honor first and have been fighting back since the mid-2000s. The first time morality was brought down upon the queer movement was in 2006. There were a series of court cases to close down the LGBT associations in Turkey, in Istanbul, and in some prominent cities for threatening general morality, the public morality. In response, instead of trying to justify the moral grounds for LGBT organizing, the movements opened the topic of morality to a deconstructive discussion. The theme of the 2007 LGBT Pride Week was general morality. And aside from panels and workshops that addressed the issue, queer folks took up the streets with widespread signs and chants that said, "To hell with your morality, general morality, whose morality is that? And most importantly, if oppression and violence is morality, then we are immoral," so on and so forth. The next year, on March 8, 2008, Tayyip Erdogan launched his reproductive agenda. In a meeting organized for the Women's Day, he addressed Turkish women by saying, "Population is what matters in an economy. In order to escape our nation of demise, you should make at least 3 children to keep the population young." The Prime Minister must have anticipated the opposition, because in the same meeting, he dismissed feminists by calling them a handful of marginals, therefore publicly accepting them into his immoral hall of marginal fame. Thousands of women protested the next day, yelling, "Prime Minister, don't piss me off. You go lay down to hatch 1 Turkling, 2 Turkling, 3 Turkling, if you like." This chant continued to keep coming back up, also during his anti-abortion campaign in 2012. And in a short-circuited logic, he doubly shrugged off and exploited the Uludere Roboski massacre of 34 Kurdish civilians and launched his anti-abortion campaign by saying, "They keep talking about Uludere. Every abortion is an Uludere." There wasn't much coherence to deconstruct right there, so feminist Kurds, queers, and alike took up the streets and yelled out the very clear difference between a state-inflicted and covered massacre of civilian citizens and an abortion. The next year in 2013, however, when Tayyip Erdogan dismissed Gezi resistors as marginals, alcoholics, enemies of morality, and chapel Jews, again, roughly plunderers or looters, there was much to deconstruct. Gezi resistors endorsed and transposed all the marginalizing labels that the Prime Minister bestowed upon them. As in the example of, "What if I'm a faggot?" or "What now that I'm a faggot?" signs, which were carried by gays and heterosexual allies, people refused to engage with the state's moral scrutiny that ultimately asks for a proof otherwise. In a case of, "Show us that you are not a faggot, prove us that you are not a chapel Jew." Instead, they turned the tables around and disputed the logic of moral manipulation and exclusion. The constituent powers of the Gezi opposition, however, included more than feminists, queers, and leftists who wanted to escape AKP's moral binds or wanted to work outside of the newer neoliberal moderate Islamic AKP regime versus the nationalist past. A substantial amount of the anti-AKP chants at the protests, including military slogans such as "We are soldiers of Mustafa Kemal," the founder of the Turkish Republic and instiller of the Unitarian ideals. This slogan, in the context of the Turkish coup d'etat history, can also be read as a call to military intervention to take down the AKP government. In the face of this, queers articulated their opposition to both the AKP government and a seemingly oppositional nationalist and militarist order by chanting, "We are soldiers of Freddie Mercury." And the only Pasha, Lord, we recognize is Zeki Müren, the Turkish counterpart of Lord Elton John in Turkey. For the time restriction, I will end my presentation right here, but if you are all interested in the topic, I can definitely suggest some other talks done by my colleagues and are available online.
Thank you.